Well, good morning, everyone. It's always such a pleasure to be here and a privilege to deliver the talk today. I think most of you know me, and hence the title of my talk today is Religion and Science and Are They Compatible? And I'd like to go back a little bit about my journey into Spiritism. In fact, even further back, because I spent most of my life without any religious beliefs. In fact, I conscientiously avoided a lot of religion because of what I saw as the turmoils in the world, the conflicts in the world. And it wasn't just a lazy decision, it was a conscientious one. I did study, I did try to see if I could find any truth for myself. At one stage in my life, I had a very good friend, very bright individual, who was a Mormon, and we talked a lot about that. But again, I just could not get beyond the doctrines and the dogmas that a lot of religions contain. And then about 4 years ago, I came across Spiritism. And what really excited me most was that Spiritism, as we all know, is built on three basic principles of philosophy, of religion, and of science. And that what really excited me was the scientific part of it. And the more I delved into it, the more Spiritism has really become a major part of my life. I don't think a day goes by without thinking of something related to what I've learned over these years. And the exciting thing is there's still so much more to learn. When one prepares a talk like this, and I started this talk actually about 3 months ago, and then because of the move, it got postponed. In fact, my original title was, Are They Mutually Exclusive? Because, again, when you read the literature, there is such a divide between religion and science in so many respects. But as I got more and more into it, I realized that not just Spiritism, which is built on science, or one of the pillars, the three pillars is science, but also there's a convergence now in most religions in the world where science and religion are coming closer and closer together. So I won't keep you on tender hooks. I'll give you the answer to the question is yes, they are very dependent. In fact, they're mutually dependent, they're interdependent, and one really does depend on the other. And the Spiritists, we couldn't see it any other way. So we're going to explore this topic, and I'm going to go back in time because I think it's interesting to realize that there's so much to learn from history when you look back on religion and how it developed over the years. So I want to start with a definition of religion. And both religion and science, these two words actually only came into existence in the 15th, 16th century. Religion, back in the time of Moses and Jesus, was more of a philosophy, more of a code of law for society. And only the concept of religion came about, say, in the mid-15th, 16th centuries. And the same with science. Science really only came about when our senses, particularly sight, were so limited. When we started to observe things and record things, there was only so much we could see. It wasn't until the advent of the telescope and the microscope and so on, again in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, that science exploded. And as we know today, the explosion is continuing at an astronomical rate. So going back to religion, religion is an organized collection of beliefs, cultural systems and worldviews that relate humanity to an order of existence. That's really the driver for religion. It tries to give us perspective into the world we live in. Many religions have narratives, symbols, sacred histories that aim to explain the meaning of life or the universe. And from their beliefs about the cosmos and human nature, people may derive morality, ethics, religious laws, or preferred lifestyles. And this is what the conventional definition of religion is. So on the other side, we have science. And whereas religion is much based on beliefs, it's very intangible. Science, of course, is the exact opposite. And that's why, again, this whole dichotomy of science and religion has been so much debated over the years. So science is knowledge about or study of the natural world based on facts learned through observation and experiment. Based on these learnings, it may be possible to construct a hypothesis, mathematical formula, to predict future events. So by studying an event and coming to a theory of why that happened, You could then set up an experiment to see why, or see if you could predict, see that experiment, that formula, that hypothesis does apply all the time. Run the experiment, see the results, and sometimes modify the hypothesis and go round and round until you end up with a picture of what is happening, an understanding, a mathematical representation of what is understand. But there's another dimension to this question of religion and science, how they're compatible. And that's the question of which religion. Because today, let's go back a little bit. So again, faith, the religious side versus facts on the scientific side. So religions. There's a whole dichotomy of religions in the world today. These symbols represent the most, I would say popular, but the most followed religions of the world today. So again, asking the question, are they compatible, religion and science? Which religion? Because all religions differ. There's certainly many common cores with the religions. And in fact, if Andrea and Marcel were here today, I'm sure they would love to share with you their experiences. Last weekend they went to an interfaith conference in Utah, I believe. 10,000 people, all faiths of the world, 5 days just understanding each other better, sharing faiths, sharing belief systems. Of the 12 religions, the Abrahamic religions, which are Christianity, Islam and Judaism, they constitute about almost half the world. 2 billion supposedly followers of Christianity, over 1 billion of Islam. Judaism is very small, it's about, I believe, about 14 million, that's all. And then you go into the other religions like Hinduism, which from Asia, particularly in India, where there's over 1 billion followers. And then some of the other more Far Eastern, the Taoism, and so on from Japan and China. Again, there are common elements in all of them. And again, a convergence on how they approach the subject of science. So I'm going to go back to some historical perspectives, because I said earlier, religion wasn't religion as such in the ancient times. It was a philosophy, and it was also a way of life, a code of life. And Pythagoras was one of the first philosophers. He called himself a lover of wisdom. He was a mathematician also, and perhaps you'd all remember him from school days with the Pythagoras' theorem. Actually, I've got a little very neat demonstration here, just to digress slightly into mathematics, but I can get this to work. Apparently not. Not to worry. I'm sure you won't miss it anyway. Oh, there we go. So it shows that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides. So you've got a fixed area, 4 equal triangles. If you rearrange them, you can prove Pythagoras' theorem. But that's digressing. So we'll go on to Socrates. Socrates was really one of the great philosophers of humankind. He's credited with being the founder of Western philosophy. And one of the principles that he talked about in his ethics and virtues, the best way for people to live is to focus on virtues rather than material wealth. And that was very much against the thought at that time. His teaching methods were very revolutionary. And he talked about the Socrates paradox. No one desires evil. No one errs or does wrong willingly or knowingly. All virtue is knowledge. Virtue is sufficient for happiness. And it's interesting that he also, again, he started the idea of this scientific method, which I mentioned earlier, about a theory and then observing to see if it supported the theory of the facts. But also, obviously, Kardec was very impressed with the work of Socrates. In the opening to the Gospel according to Spiritism, in the introduction, he spends about a dozen pages talking about Socrates. In fact, he draws a parallel with Socrates to Jesus. And the three parallels that he drew were one, that basically Socrates never wrote anything himself. It was basically Plato and his students who wrote all his thoughts. He also was very much against the established order of the time. And in fact, he was actually condemned to death unless he recanted his views, and he decided not to, and he eventually ended up taking his life with arsenic. So again, Kardec talks about the parallels between Socrates and Jesus. So student of Socrates was Plato, and he wrote most of the discoveries and the knowledge base that Socrates created in his existence. Mathematician also, he started Academy of Athens, which was a group of all the top philosophers of the time, and started looking at religion and spirituality. Then later on came Aristotle. We're down now to what, 300 BC. Again, philosopher and science. He started the first library. Of course, in these days, everything was written. Knowledge was very limited, and what had to be conserved was written down by hand. And he started actually a sort of a production line of writing of books and created the first museum. And again, his knowledge following on from Socrates' scientific method, it was based on perception. So fast forwarding to, now we're in the 100 AD after Christ. And I want to talk about a gentleman who probably I didn't know about, quite honestly, until I started doing this research. And this is Ptolemy. And he also was a mathematician, astronomer, geographer, and astrologer. Greek, Egyptian descent, but held Roman citizenship, lived in Alexandria. And he wrote several scientific treatises. And three of them were very important to the development later of science. First was called the Almagest, which was astronomical treatise. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. He started the first mapping. In fact, when Columbus went across to discover Americas, he was using some of the maps that were actually created by Ptolemy. And then another work in 4 books, Tetabulus, linked astrology with what Aristotle taught in philosophy. But his biggest contribution was the Almagest. And it basically created a model, and this was created by observation, again, by the naked eye, over a period of many, tens of years, observing the positions of the stars as they rotate around. And he came up with a theory, what's called the geocentric model, which puts the Earth at the center of our solar system, of the world as they knew it then, followed by the moon, followed by Saturn, and eventually the sun is somewhere out there. But as we know today from our knowledge, this is incorrect. But again, you've got to put yourself back in those times. We hadn't got the knowledge we have today. We get up in the morning and we see the sun rising over Sunny Isles and setting over the Everglades, and we see the stars coming around day after day. You can understand why people thought the Earth was flat and everything revolved around the Earth. That theory stood for almost 1,200 years, partly because of the domination of the church. They would not have any contradictions to it until came along Copernicus. This is not a very flattering portrait of him, but that was his self-portrait, by the way. So he then started to develop the idea that the sun was the center of the universe. Again, the universe as they knew it being the planetary system. And that was called the heliocentric model. So he departed from the Ptolemaic system and put the Earth at the center of the universe. And it was regarded as a launching point for modern astronomy and scientific revolution. And again, here we now see the corrected model, his model, with the sun at the center, and then even the Earth and the Moon still both revolve around the sun rather than revolve around each other, but there was advancements made. And again, it was based on observation, time measurements, and a lot of mathematics. It was devised over a decade, and it was actually only published in the year of his death. And he dedicated it to the church because he felt that by his calculations, the basic Julian calendar was incorrect, and his model more accurately predicted the time of the year and so on. So following that, about 100 years later, along came Galileo. And Galileo was he had more modern tools. He was part of the development, part of the group of engineers, that we could call them engineers at that time, that started to develop the instruments to give us bigger insight into the world we live in today. And the telescope being the principal one. He also developed compass and other navigational instruments as well. But working on Copernicus's work, he took the heliocentric theory a lot further and developed it more more tightly as a theory. And he's been called the father of modern observational astronomy, the father of modern physics, and the father of modern science. That being said, the Roman Catholic Church at the time did not believe at all. It was contrary to the church writings. And he was actually forced to recant, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest, even though he made a tremendous contribution to science. He spent 20 years under house arrest. And as often happens in this proverbial conflict of science and religion, the religious group will go back to the Bible and take literal passages from the Bible and say, "Oh no, it can't be because the Bible says this." And these were three of the texts in the Bible that the Inquisition used to contradict what Galileo was saying. But eventually, about 100 years after his death, Pope Benedict XIV did authorize the publication of all Galileo's work. So it became more accepted into both the religious and the scientific communities. Okay, I want to move on now to what is called the Age of Enlightenment. This was appeared in the 18th century. And if you look at the spirits literature, there's strong evidence and strong messages from spirits to say that during that period of time, a lot of more evolved spirits were sent to the earth and created an actual explosion, a revolution in terms of thinking. Principal goals of Enlightenment thinkers were liberty, progress, reason, tolerance, ending of abuses of church and state. Again, even up until this time, the church and the monarchies in various countries were the dominant political forces. So the Enlightenment movement was marked by increasing empiricism, scientific rigor and reductionism, along with increased questioning of religious orthodoxy. And it really started a revolution, both in philosophy, in science, religion, and started the separation of church and state, and society and culture. Again, it was during this time that we had the explosion of the Renaissance painters, music and arts and painting and everything else, poetry. And even in politics and economics. At the end of the 17th century was the French Revolution, which was the first time that monarchies were started to being overthrown and the populace were having more of a voice in the reign. And one of the catalysts of all this era of revolution was the printing press, because as I said earlier, all books were written, handwritten, knowledge was very limited to a few elite. But in the middle of the 15th century, Gutenberg invented the printing press, which made possible multiple copies of books. And you can see the explosion up to 1 million books in the 18th century when this was happening. And that helped spread that knowledge information. So the information base, instead of being kept contained to a few, spread to the many. So I want to move on again, another 50 years in front, to Allan Kardec. And we all know that he was the founder of Spiritism. And again, I want to emphasize the three pillars of religion, science, and philosophy. And his first book, the Spirits book, was really the philosophical foundation of Spiritism. In it, he asked, over 1,019 questions to the spirits, often repeating the same questions to different spirits, so you get concurrence. And then he organized it, codified it into the book, which is really the basis for what we know and understand as Spiritism. His second book, 4 years later, was the Medium's book. And that book talked about communications and interactions between what we know now as the material world, but with the spiritual world that we know is out there. And to some or lesser extent, we all communicate or influenced by the spiritual world. And this book really talked about all the basis. He didn't write it, it was written. The messages came from spirits through communications with mediums. And he followed that later on by the Gospel. The Gospel really looks at the religious and the moral aspects of Spiritism. It talks a lot about Jesus and interpreting Jesus' teachings in the light of Spiritism. And then finally, Heaven and Hell, which is really, it demystifies the concept of the specific places, i.e. heaven and hell. When we die, we go to heaven if we're good, if we go to hell, we're a bad person. And this book brings out the concept that really heaven or hell is all in our mind. So the way we believe, the way we think, really determines what heaven or hell we live in. When I was doing research for this talk, I came across this gentleman here called Julio Padovan. He's a Brazilian. He's part of the Spiritist Center in New York. And in April, he did a video which is available on YouTube. He just go on YouTube and put in Julio Padovan, you'll find this video. It's over an hour long, but it is, I found it extremely interesting and enlightening in terms of what Genesis is all about. But he also makes a point in his opening remarks about Kardec and about the books. And he says that, and I think it's very, very true, the more I think about it, and I haven't read all of the Heaven and Hell yet, but the Spirit's book and the Gospel should be taken in concurrently. They're not one, you should read this one first and that one second, no. They relate to each other so much. In fact, he equates the Spirit's book as the technical manual, and the Gospel is the user's manual. So it's how we apply that, the teachings from the Spirits into our daily lives by applying it in the way Jesus taught us. And I think that was a very good analogy. And the same goes with these two books as well. The medium books is the technical manual on how the Spirit and the incarnate world communicate with each other. But the user's manual is how you apply it. What is your thought process? What do you believe? So his final book, published about a year before his death, was Genesis. And everyone talks that Genesis is really the scientific foundation of Spiritism. And I think, first of all, you have to ask the question, why a fifth book? You know, why not a pair of books, as the other two were? But again, I'm going back to, and I won't take credit for this, but Julio Padovan says that the Spirits were very fugal. They tried to keep the words to a minimum. And the idea of the Genesis is really to give that extra dimension to the whole philosophy of Spiritism, but without spending too much time. There's a limit to what we can take in our stage of evolution. So Genesis is actually subtitled The Miracles and Predictions According to Spiritism. And in these opening remarks, Kardec says that the Spiritist doctrine is the result of the collective and concordant teaching of the Spirits. Science is called upon to present Genesis in accordance with the laws of nature. God proves God's greatness and power by immutability and not by the suspension of the divine laws. For God, the past and the present are the future. And what is interesting is, when you get into this book, it's not really a book about science, but it's a book about God. And if you go back to the four preceding books, there's actually very little reference to God. The first 13 or so questions of the Spirit's book do talk about God. But the rest of the books talk about Jesus, yes, talk about virtues, talk about suffering, talk about many, many things. But the word God doesn't appear very, very little. And the core of Genesis is really to try and get to understanding what is this figure, this whatever you want to call it, that we call God. The other point that I think becomes very clear from Genesis is science is continually evolving. And we've seen that from the previous examples of geocentric and heliocentric theories of the planets and the systems. So what is true today will be replaced by new knowledge in the future. Newton's laws of mechanics and gravity and so on were fine for the time, but they don't apply to today's knowledge of subatomic particles, and we go to quantum theory, and then we go on from there. So science has ever been evolving, and there's really no such thing as an absolute truth. In science, we talked about science being fact-based, that we observe and we get a fact and we have a theory, but in reality, that theory might change tomorrow, and that's the whole beauty of science. It's continuously evolving, and it's the beauty of mankind and the thought process we go through. We're continually looking for new explanations. So I just want to give a couple of quotes here from Genesis. Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is actually the role of science in Genesis. And he talks in this section here about the Bible and how to interpret the Bible, Genesis, are the first, those 4 chapters of the New Testament. The Bible obviously contains things that reason, developed by science, could not accept today. and others that seem strange and objectable, because they're connected with customs that no longer exist. But alongside this, one will be biased not to recognize that it contains great and beautiful things. Allegory takes up considerable space in it, and behind this veil it hides sublime truths that will come to light if we only look for the essence of the thought, because then the absurd disappears. So really he's saying, yeah, the Bible is important, it's a beautiful document, and as there's so many sacred texts, but you have to, as mankind evolves, we have to interpret them in different ways. And again, going back to religions and why some of the conflict in the world, a lot of those conflicts originate in a very rigid interpretation of a text that was written at the time 2,000, 1,800, 1,500 years ago. At the end of that chapter, this chapter 4, he talks about the spirit and material worlds in constant contact and are thus in solidarity with each other. Both have their share of the action in Genesis. Without knowledge of the laws that govern the former, it would be impossible to construct a complete Genesis, as it is for a sculpture to give life to a statue. Only now, while neither material science nor spiritual science has spoken their final word, that should be word, I'm sorry about that, do humans possess the two elements suitable for shedding light on this huge problem. It was necessary to have these two keys to arrive at a solution, even an approximate one. So I think at the time Kardec recognized that the answer was not there, it was still evolving. But the answer would lie in science, and so science view for the material world and the spiritual world. So that was in the 1850s. And let's just move on now to the last 150 years. And when you see what's happened since the time of Kardec in terms of science and technology and the influence it's had on us all, there's really been an explosion of understanding, of development it's really difficult to keep track of. Even today, I think we all struggle with the new iPhone that comes out, or the new software, or it's just so much happening that it becomes really mind-boggling. But you look at the advancements they've made to mankind in the time. Medicine and health. We're living now at least twice, if not 3 times longer than they were at the time of Kardec, and how medicine has brought, at least if it hasn't cured diseases, it certainly eased the pain and suffering. Look at space exploration. Again, to go back to the time of Galileo, who invented the first telescope. Today we sent the Horizon spacecraft to Pluto. It took 10 years to get there, bringing back these amazing photographs. You've seen them. We had the Kepler telescope out there discovering potential planets that could harbour life just like ours, and there's more than 1,000 already on the list. The Hubble telescope, of course, has brought these amazing images of galaxies way, way beyond, light years away from the planet. Transportation, at the time of Kardec, it probably took him 2 or 3 months to come from Paris to Miami, but now we can do it in less than 8 hours. What else? Communications, incredible how the ease in which we can communicate with one another and with humankind all over the world today, which we couldn't do in the time of Kardec. The biology and DNA, we go more and more and deeper into the molecules and how the codes are passed on, and human evolution. I was going to talk a little bit about Darwin, but really it wasn't space. But since Darwin, and there was a lot, again, that was the current thought at that time, it was a gigantic step in terms of understanding of the evolution of the human race and life in general. But there were certain gaps in it and certain flaws, but since the advent of DNA, that is becoming more clearer and clearer. Food supply, even though there's a lot of poverty and hunger in this world, we have the capability of producing food for every individual of the 7+ billion people we have on this planet. The problem is we just don't know how to share it. We're too greedy sometimes. Energy, again, that's a time, now we can live in South Florida in the summer because of air conditioning, we can live in the northern climes. We have so much energy, and there's new horizons to energy, which hopefully we can explore without destroying the planet before it's too late. Unfortunately, energy has also been used in very sinful ways in terms of weapons and bombs, and we see so much evidence of that today. Atomic physics, we're going closer and closer to the elementary particle. Every time we seem to discover an elementary particle, we find there's another elementary particle behind that one. Computing power, not to say any more about that. And all this has helped to explode wealth in this world. The problem is we still don't know how to distribute that. There's enough wealth in this world so that nobody needs to be hungry. Everybody can be educated, but unfortunately humankind is still too selfish, and we're still a long way to go in that regard. So finally, I'd just like to finish with the next 25 years, what's going to happen. Actually, this is my own personal bucket list of what I'd like to see happen. I've decided I'm going to live another 25 years so I can hopefully see some of these happening. But I think there will be, again, eventually, and we're very close to this, that religion and science in terms of the spirit world and the material world and how measurements are made and how eventually science will come to a total understanding with religion on how the spirit world is, which we can't see. But it will be there and will be proven. So on one side you've got religion, science. So my first one on the bucket list is probably you've seen the film Stephen Hawking's The Theory of Everything. And that really, the idea is it will unite the subatomic particles with the expansion of the universe. It's just the theory of everything. It sounds beautiful, I hope. I probably won't be able to understand it when it does come, but never mind, I'll certainly try. One thing that intrigues me about when you look at human evolution and you look at Darwinism and how the first small cells and reproduction of cells and so on through to the animals and eventually to the apes, which are our descendants. But at some stage in that whole evolutionary cycle, the spirit was born inside a living organism on this world, and that's something that to me is still, I would love to know more about that. I believe, as you were saying, Andre Louise has some ideas about that anyway. So the third on my bucket list is the discovery of extraterrestrial life, and I think we're very close to that. There's more and more, it's almost concrete evidence now that there's water on Mars, and probably underneath the surface, but it certainly existed there. And I hope some science, and even here on Earth, we're finding life forms in incredible places that we never expected life forms. At the bottom of the ocean where there are sulfur vents, so it's very, very acidic, but there's life forms there. There's no light, there's no oxygen, there's acidic, but there's life forms that are growing. In deep caves in South America, again, no light, but there's living forms, living plants, living animals, living insects. So all these indicate that elsewhere there's got to be, and just the pure numbers, and again the discovery with the Kepler telescope, that there's so many planets that have exactly the same conditions of a star like ours, the same size as ours, revolving around the sun, another sun, that it's obvious that there is life out there. There's been a tremendous advancement. Obama created an objective to try and understand more of the human brain. There's been a lot of focus on a lot of deeper and deeper understanding of the human brain. But again, the connection between the soul and the human brain is still something that's very nebulous. And finally, I just want to finish with this one. Dark matter and dark energy are they're predictions because they had to be there, because the universe is expanding and expanding at an ever-increasing rate. And the only way that can be explained is this energy and matter, which, by the way, constitute 95%, 94% of the world as we know it today. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it is. So, here we are, all these advancements in science, all these technologies, all these different instrumentation, but we still don't know what dark matter and dark energy is. Maybe there's some connection with the spirit world there, who knows. So finally, I want to go back to my opening slide and just end with this quote of Einstein. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. Thank you very much.
Thank you.